Hi, we're here with Sarah Rose-Jensen, a PhD student at SCAR, who's going to share her experiences from the trauma healing class that takes place in Cambodia. So thank you for joining us today, Sarah.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
So why do students go to Cambodia to learn about trauma healing?
Cambodia emerged from a period of colonialism and the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime, and then a period of Vietnamese occupation. And so it's in many ways a very young country, and there's a massive number of people that are suffering the effects of trauma related to the genocide, to the Khmer Rouge, to the Vietnamese occupation. Mm-hmm. And so Cambodia is a really rich place to learn about trauma and trauma healing, because it allows you to go there and meet with people who have been torture survivors, have been trauma victims, but it's also a beautifully vibrant country that's emerging out of this, and so it's a young and hopeful country as well.
Nice. So why were you interested in taking the class?
I was interested in taking the trauma healing course because I've always been interested in trauma. I volunteered for a long time with veterans organizations, veterans and their families, and seeing the effects that trauma has on individuals and the way that trauma kind of can extend to the family and, you know, even the neighborhood and affect everyone.
Mm-hmm. So what was the strongest takeaway from the class for you?
That's hard. The strongest takeaway was learning about not just how individuals deal with trauma, but how practitioners deal with trauma.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
That we don't, unfortunately, in our discipline talk a lot about self-care and secondary trauma, and you know, while in Cambodia we were learning about the fact that, you know, working with individuals who are traumatized is hard for the practitioner too, mm-hmm. and that, you know, you need to develop a skill set for dealing with that. And that was something I hadn't before then spent a lot of time thinking about.
So when you studied trauma healing, you were studying trauma healing for the people and for the practitioners as well?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I'm interested in your background of trauma. Okay. Because you said you work with veterans?
Yeah.
It's really cool. What, like, in what capacity?
I was actually a civilian ally with two organizations, Iraq Veterans Against the War, mm-hmm. and the Civilian Soldier Alliance, both of which work with veterans and their families and active duty military professionals and their families who are kind of questioning their service and possibly trying to get out of the military, considering, you know, refusing to redeploy, or dealing with the trauma of, you know, having served in a war that they now kind of don't necessarily agree with. And so, although it wasn't, you know, I was a volunteer, we weren't doing trauma care, it was still, you know, I was really caught up in trauma and trauma work because we were working with individuals who were very deeply traumatized.
How did you get involved in that?
I've been an anti-war activist for a long time,
okay.
And
that's interesting that you're working with the veterans of it. I like that though.
Yeah, and that's why
because you're against the war, not against the soldiers.
Exactly. I have a button that says pro soldier, pro peace.
I like that. Okay, yeah. Keep going.
And so it was. It was kind of, I worked for a long time with anti-war groups, and I got kind of burnt out with like the standard, like, let's stand in the streets and make a sign and yell.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to be looking at what can I do that's a little more proactive, and working with veterans seemed like this was, and that was part of what got me really committed to anti-war work, was meeting anti-war veterans and talking with them.
So is that what brought you to SCAR, or?
Somewhat indirectly. I've also worked a lot training young people in nonviolent civil resistance and nonviolent communication, and so I was kind of looking, and I also worked in a women's labor organization, labor rights and job training.
Okay. And
so kind of looking at like my activism, my work with labor, my work with teaching and training, it kind of all kind of came together, and when I heard about SCAR, I'm like, oh,
perfect.
This is the place, exactly. Yeah, it was ICAR then, but it seems like, I can put together like all these different skill sets that I've been working on into a career.
So what does trauma healing mean? Like, what is...
Well, trauma, a lot of times when we talk about trauma, we think about, like physical trauma. And physical trauma that needs to be dealt with, but there's also emotional and psychological trauma.
Okay.
And some of that is what people talk about, with post-traumatic stress disorder, that's trauma. But the effects of trauma can extend beyond PTSD, and entire communities can be traumatized, and you see this often in refugee populations, that people, have to leave a home, are uprooted, end up in a refugee camp, which, it might be stable, but it's not a home, it's not a place.
Of course.
And so there's the trauma of leaving home, but then the continued trauma of being in a refugee camp, not being able to work, not being able to, travel, not being able to provide for your family. And so it creates a lot of stress on individuals and on families and communities.
So what do you do then? Like, how do you heal this trauma? Like, through years of therapy, or what?
There's a lot of different ways. Al Fortes, who taught the class that I took in Cambodia,
okay.
He had a wonderful exercise that he did with participants over the course of several days, of mostly using the visual arts to explore what was life like before the trauma.
Okay.
What was it like during the trauma? What was it like after the trauma? And then finally,
where do you see your life?
Where do you see your life? Yeah, and it was really fascinating to look at the drawings done by some of the people he was working with, mostly Khmer refugees from Burma living in Thailand. And the past and the future were very coherent. Like they, lots of people drew villages on a river with a house and a school. But then the during and immediately after the trauma, they were, people, it went from being like a very traditional sort of a scene that you understand to like several different scenes together, or just scribbles and confusion. And it was really interesting to me that these were people that they're from the same geographic region, but they didn't necessarily know each other. But their ideas of their past and their future were the same, whereas their views of their trauma were so incredibly different.
Okay.
And so that's part of it, is doing trauma work, is helping people see where they are and see where they want to be, and kind of reconciling their past with their future, and helping people find a way to kind of move forward. And some of that is kind of therapeutic technique,
right.
But obviously, we're conflict practitioners, we're not therapists.
Exactly.
But we talk more about the concrete of how do we move beyond this to something different? How do we create something new?
Great. So where has your time in Cambodia led you? Are you focusing on trauma healing now, or?
Actually, the interesting part for me was I'm focusing on Cambodia, but not on trauma.
Okay.
I'm back to where I started looking at labor issues.
Okay.
Cambodia has a lot of problems with human trafficking, migration, forced migration, and forced labor. And there's an emerging labor movement in Cambodia, led mostly by youth, especially young women.
Oh.
And so, although I went there for trauma work, I ended up being more interested in the labor issues. And I'm hopefully going to be going back to Cambodia this summer or soon to do research on migration and forced labor.
Great, for your dissertation?
Yeah, for my dissertation.
Nice. So when you were in Cambodia, did you do anything besides trauma healing?
Yeah. So while in Cambodia, I got to do some traveling, both with the group and on my own. And one of the most evocative places we went was a place called Tul Sleng, or S21. And it was the Khmer Rouge torture center.
Oh.
Yeah. And it was, it had been a school, a secondary school, and it was really, I struggle for the right words for it because it was horrific, but also incredibly eye-opening and thought-provoking. That a lot of people have heard about the killing fields in Cambodia, which is where many of the executions took place. But Tuol Sleng was where dissenters and some often just regular people were tortured. And when the Vietnamese invaded to oust the Khmer Rouge, there were several people undergoing torture in Tuol Sleng at the time. The Khmer Rouge forces abandoned the center and retreated. And by the time the Vietnamese reached the city center, those people had died, unfortunately. Oh, wow. But the rooms in which they were found have been left as they are, with an iron bed, no mattress, and various shackles and torture instruments. And then on the wall, a nearly life-size photo of the person's body as they were found. And they're buried in the courtyard.
Wow.
And so it's the sort of place that you almost don't know how to process. You just kind of stand there. But it's also really horrific because part of the Khmer Rouge their goal was to kind of eradicate the bourgeoisie and the middle class and the upper class, and they did this by abolishing schools, sending children as young as 5 and 6 into the fields to work. And the fact that Tuol Sleng itself was a school, and I mean, when I say was a school, there's still the chalkboards are there. There are desks there. You can see that this was a school. And, to have this place get turned from a school into a torture center and now a museum of the genocide is really remarkable. And a lot of the people that work there were imprisoned there, including an artist who, after the conflict was over, recreated many of the scenes that he saw in their, the posters that he drew are hanging various places in Tuol Sleng.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's really. But just across the street, there's a restaurant and training center called the Bodhi Tree, which in Buddhism, the Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree and received enlightenment. And the Bodhi Tree restaurant is now a training center for young people interested in the hospitality industry. And so it's there isn't a lot of job training in Cambodia, and it's committed to providing fair labor, fair wages, and they focus on. They also have art displays for Cambodian artists, and it's just kind of this interesting juxtaposition of the incredible horrors on this side of the street, and then this place that's trying to bring a new life to Cambodia on the other side of the street.
Nice.
Yeah.
Have any further thoughts about Cambodia or your experience there?
I think that Southeast Asia in general is going to be kind of one of the next hotspots that we're looking at. That while I was there, people were saying we had the Arab Spring, next it's the Southeast Asian Spring, and so with continued agitation for reform in Thailand and the political openings in Burma, but those coming along with religious and communal conflict in Burma, and also the influx of development in the form of aid and in the form of just sheer development in the region. I think that Southeast Asia is going to be one of the next places that conflict students are going to be looking at.
Interesting. Well, thank you for joining us today. I look forward to seeing your further research on Cambodia.
Great, thank you.